Welcome to the Journal Editorial Report. I'm Paul Gigot. Another government shutdown was averted this week when President Trump signed a bipartisan budget deal while also declaring a national emergency at the southern border. The president opening a new front in his battle with lawmakers over border funding with his announcement Friday that he is moving $8 billion in previously appropriated funds toward construction of the wall. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi accusing the president of making an end run around Congress and warning Republicans of the precedent he is setting.
A Democratic president can do that. Democratic president can declare emergencies as well. So the precedent that the president is setting here is something that should be met with great unease and dismay by the Republicans.
Let's bring in Wall Street Journal columnist and editorial board member Kim Strassel, columnist Jason Riley, and editorial board member Kyle Peterson. So, Jason, what do you think of the emergency declaration?
Well, I think if you're President Trump, you have a political emergency here insofar as you've made campaign promises about building a wall and don't have much to show for it right now. But I don't see how this really is a legitimate national security emergency. I mean, just using the own administration's data, illegal crossings are at their lowest level in decades, since the 1970s. In 2017, the administration was bragging that they had the lowest illegal entries on record ever in the United States. So, yes, there are problems on the border. We need a better asylum policy. We need more judges adjudicating claims and so forth. There are places where a wall could be an effective deterrent on the border. I acknowledge that. But whether this rises to the level of a national emergency, I don't see the argument there.
So do you think he'll be sued?
Oh, he will definitely be sued. That was promised even before the words left his mouth. Yeah.
Okay. And so, Kyle, but the president says, look, other presidents have declared national emergencies for even lesser urgent matters. Is that going to matter as this proceeds in the courts?
I don't think it will. So if you look at the law, what he's going to do is he's going to move reportedly about $3.5 billion worth of military construction funds. One of the laws that allows him to do that allows him to move those funds for, quote, use of the armed forces. So unless, Pancho Villa is coming over the border raiding American towns.
But he has deployed the military to the border.
Right, but it's hard to see how putting a wall up there is for use of the armed forces. It's going to be manned by the Border Patrol. And so I think this is going to get slapped down big time.
Well, but, I mean, do you think that this could? I mean, the president says, look, I'm probably going to lose in the lower courts. I'm probably going to lose maybe in the Ninth Circuit, but then I'll win, like I did on the travel ban, at the Supreme Court. And there are some conservative scholars, legal scholars, who say that the National Emergencies Act upon which this is based does have a pretty expansive reading of how the president can define a national emergency. Could that be what ultimately lets him do this?
It's possible, but if you have trust in judges who believe in reading the law the way the law is written, if this is a national emergency, then as Nancy Pelosi suggests, basically anything can be deemed a national emergency. So there has to be, I hope, some appetite to restrain that authority that the president has been granted.
I think Trump sees this as a win-win. He gets sued. He goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Either they say he's right or they say he's wrong. Then he has the issue to run on. Not only the wall, but these liberal judges that won't let him do what he wants to do.
You mean his own Supreme Court nominees who won't let him do it? Is that what you're saying? How is that a winner?
You're overthinking this.
Well, Kim, let me ask you about the politics of this in terms of Capitol Hill, because the House is going to introduce a resolution, we know, which will override the president, and I think they'll pass. The Senate then is going to take it up, and it only needs to pass with a majority vote under the Emergencies Act. So what happens if 4, 5, 6 Republicans go over to the other side, and you have the House and Senate both saying this is disapproved?
Yeah, and there will be Republicans who do that, because we've already had a number come out who, on the basis of the legal argument and the precedence argument, have said, we didn't want the president to do this, we disagree with it, folks like Senator Marco Rubio and others. So it will pass in the House. It will come up in the Senate likely and pass there. And then you have two phenomena. You've got Republicans split voting against the president. And then the president is going to have to veto that resolution. And again, it's not likely that the House or the Senate could override that veto. So his decision would stand. He'd knock down that resolution. But again, it's a divided Republican Party, which is never a good look for a party out there to be having. And that's one thing the president's forced on this now.
Well, and so let's assume that it's enjoined by the lower courts. How is that going to look, Kim, if he's overridden by the Senate, has to and the House, and then has to veto, and then it's enjoined by the lower courts? The president will not be able to take that money and use the wall. Will he look weak for having taken this step rather than what he could have done, which is say, look, I got $1.4 billion for the wall, I got $23 billion for other things, and declare victory?
Well, right, and that's one of the head-scratching things here, is because in addition to the money that he just got as a spending bill, part of this $8 billion that they're talking about is coming from things that he arguably does have easy authority to take. So some of this, for instance, they want to use some civil asset forfeiture money, which is money we take from bad guys, drug interdiction money, and even some unobligated funds in the military budget that aren't military construction that he might, in fact, have authority. That gets him another big chunk of dollars. So why also go down the road of this national emergency, which is going to cause a court battle, when it really is not that much dollars you're talking about in the end toward that wall project?
Kyle, I want to raise here, at least briefly, the left, the Democrat left, which is now saying this is an unprecedented abuse of power. And yet they were silent when President Obama tried to use his executive authority to push through legalization for work permits for 4 million illegal immigrants. There's a double standard here.
For sure, and tribalism is a heck of a thing. It's interesting too. On the reverse side, the Republicans who decried President Obama when he made moves to protect Dreamers under prosecutorial discretion are doing the same thing. They're saying that this national emergency is great, and it's bodes ill for the future.
Yeah, if partisanship defines constitutional barriers as opposed to actual constitutional barriers. All right, when we come back, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says he'll bring the Green New Deal to the Senate floor for a vote. Why Democrats are crying.
And see how they feel about the Green New Deal.
That was Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell this week saying he'll bring the Green New Deal to a vote on the Senate floor, forcing Democrats to go on record with their support for the controversial proposal that was introduced last week by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey. Democrats are crying foul, calling McConnell's move a political stunt.
This is all they can muster, a political stunt. This cheap, cynical ploy evidently represents the sum total of Senate Republicans' leadership on the vital issue of climate change.
We're back with Kim Strassel, Jason Riley, and Wall Street Journal editorial board member Alicia Finley. So before we get to the vote, Senate issue, what do you make of the reception, political reception generally, to the Green New Deal?
Well, it's being widely ridiculed, among the public at least. Because it's so far-fetched. You have to retrofit every building in America, basically banish fossil fuels within 10 years.
10 years.
10 years. There's even a bit about maybe somehow containing the carbon or methane emitted by cows. It's completely ridiculous.
But the Democrats a lot of Democrats are supporting it. How many supporters are there in the House and Senate right now?
There's about 67 in the House and about a dozen in the Senate.
And some of them, though, are very prominent and running for president.
I don't think they've even read it. They don't even know what's in it. I think they endorsed it because the quote-unquote deal, Green New Deal.
But Kamala Harris
Kamala
is for
Harris,
it.
Cory Booker, Kirsten Gillibrand, Amy Klobuchar. That's right.
Interesting that Sherrod Brown, though, who may also run for president, who's from Ohio, backed away and said, I'm not going to endorse all these details.
Well, partly because this is what would really kill manufacturing workers and a lot of union jobs.
In Ohio.
In Ohio and the Midwest.
Okay. Senator McConnell bringing it up for a vote. How is it? Explain to me, Jason. You're a political seer, sage. Explain to me, how is it a stunt to ask Democrats to vote on something they have proposed?
Exactly. Watching that clip of McConnell, he seemed to barely be able to contain a smirk there at the end. But that's exactly what he's challenging them to do. Put your money where your mouth is here. Let's see if you're really for all of the stuff that Alicia was just laying out there. I also wonder if many Democrats realize that the New Deal, the actual New Deal, where they get the name for the Green New Deal from, wasn't very successful, Paul. I mean, it was designed to get us out of the Great Depression and tackle unemployment. It didn't. World War II got us out of the Great Depression because it ended the New Deal.
Yeah, but that's an icon. That's a political, historical icon among Democrats because it includes Social Security and all of those.
Sure, but on its own terms was a failure, and I don't think the Green New Deal will be any more successful, particularly when the public realizes what exactly is in there. Things like ending the combustible engine in vehicles.
Internal combustion engine. Yeah.
I mean, it's not something. Flights and being replaced with high-speed trains, that sort of thing. I don't think the general public's going to go for that.
So, Kim, this reminds me a little bit of every time when Democrats talk about climate change and the problem, they think they're on the advantage. But every time this moves to what do you do about it, the public says, well, wait a minute. You're trying to ask me to raise taxes or change my lifestyle or do something really dramatic, and they lose. I'm reminded of the Kyoto Protocol when Bill Clinton was president, came up for a vote in the Senate and lost 95-0. Remember cap and trade, which passed the House in 2009, didn't even get a vote in a Senate with 59 Democrats in 2009 or 10. So how do you explain that disconnect?
Well, and some people would argue that passing that cap and trade bill through the House was among the contributing factors why House Democrats lost control of that chamber back in 2010 because it was so immensely unpopular among so many constituents. And this is, you just put your finger on it, Paul. It's why Republicans, it's why they want to hold a vote on this, and it's why they want the discussion to be about the practicalities and about the cost. Because when you just throw out there, what do you think about climate change? Yeah, there's a lot of people that say, well, we should be doing something about it. When you actually get to the nitty-gritty about what would have to be done, and the fact that other major polluters and people in the world like China and India are doing nothing, and so American contribution to this would really make no real dent in carbon emissions whatsoever, that's when people begin to back away. And that's why Republicans want this vote, and that's where they want the debate to be.
So, Alicia, do you think that the Democrats are going to walk away from this then? Because it has been welcomed with something less than hosannas. Or are they going to keep plowing ahead in the presidential race?
I do think they're going to plow ahead and
Why?
say, well, this is going to be a goal. We can't achieve this necessarily in 10 years, but, we need to do something about climate change just because it's so totemic to the left. That we must do something about climate change, and here's supposedly a plan, and also meets all their other entitlement plans in terms of a jobs guarantee, paid family leave, even paid vacation. It kind of encompasses everything that the progressive movement stands for.
All right. Thank you all. When we come back, freshman Congresswoman Ilhan Omar forced to apologize this week for her anti-Semitic comments, what the controversy says about the Democratic Party's fraying support for Israel. Next.
And I think she should either resign from Congress or she should certainly resign from the House Foreign Affairs Committee.
President Trump this week calling on Minnesota Congresswoman Ilhan Omar to resign following a series of tweets that were widely seen as anti-Semitic. Omar claimed on Twitter that her congressional colleagues defend Israel for the money and that the pro-Israel group AIPAC was paying lawmakers for their support. The Congresswoman apologized after Democratic leaders condemned her statement, saying in a statement, quote, "We are and will always be strong supporters of Israel in Congress because we understand that our support is based on shared values and strategic interests. Legitimate criticism of Israel's policies is protected by the values of free speech and democratic debate that the United States and Israel share, but Congresswoman Omar's use of anti-Semitic tropes and prejudicial accusations about Israel's supporters is deeply offensive." Let's bring in former White House press secretary and Fox News contributor, Ari Fleischer. So welcome, Ari. Good to see you again. So let me ask you what you think of the Omar episode and how Democrats handled it.
It's the personification of the growing problem the Democrats have with the anti-Israel movement in their grassroots. And it's been underway for generations, frankly. Look, Paul, the Democrats have increasingly at the grassroots been walking away from Israel. Pew, the polling organization, has routinely asked, in the struggle between the Israeli and Palestinians, who do you sympathize with more? And in 2001, almost 20 years ago, when they asked that question, 50% of Republicans said they sympathize more with Israel, 38% of Democrats. That was a 12-point Israel gap. Today, Paul, that gap is 52 points. 79% of Republicans told Pew they sympathize more with Israel than the Palestinians. Democrat support is down to 27%.
So what you're saying,
52-point drop.
But what that suggests, Ari, is you're suggesting that somehow Ilhan Omar reflects a major point of view within the Democratic Party, that movement. What explains that kind of change in public sentiment? Because, as you know, I mean, Harry Truman is the president who recognized Israel, and Israel's always had bipartisan support.
You know, frankly, I think the Democrats have turned their back on Israel. They have forgotten the history of Israel. The fact that after the Holocaust, the world got together through the United Nations and gave Israel that land. And the day Israel was born, the Arab nations attacked Israel. And the heart of the problem is the Arab nations, too many of them, other than Egypt and Jordan, haven't recognized Israel's right to exist.
Is this a failure of leadership
on the that the Democrats don't talk about or they have forgotten about? It's not taught in schools.
So you're saying that the Democratic leadership here, even though they condemned Omar's remarks, is responsible for not leading on the issue itself enough and expressing their support vocally enough for Israel?
The Democrat leadership is squeezed. I still think there are many Democrat leaders, Steny Hoyer, the Democratic whip, for example, who is a majority leader, who is still a strong supporter of Israel. But you can't have the grassroots be so anti-Israel without it eventually weakening the leaders, without it eventually electing congressmen and women who reflect the grassroots, as in the case of Ilhan Omar. Look, don't forget at Barack Obama's convention when the Democrats removed the line that had been in their convention platform since 2008, that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. It was removed. Then when they discovered it was removed in a platform committee, they tried to put it back on the floor, and they were met with resounding boos on the floor. And it sounded like the grassroots Democrats objected to putting the line back. The chairman had to just gavel it through with old-fashioned muscle because he knew the majority of delegates on the floor opposed calling Jerusalem the capital, despite it had been in the Democrat platform before.
Yeah, I remember.
This is the rebellion in the grassroots.
I remember that episode, but I want to ask you about this issue that Omar and her supporters would respond to you and say, look, I'm not anti-Semitic. What we're doing is just putting opposition to Israel's policies on the table. And we ought to be able, as Americans, to debate that. And that doesn't mean that you can bring up, anytime anybody opposes Israel on anything, that they can be accused of anti-Semitism. Isn't that a fair point?
Look, the new papering over is to say I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Israel, and there's a difference when there's very little difference.
Why is there not a difference? I mean, we're talking about individuals versus a government policy.
Because what you see is the case of Congresswoman Omar. She says that the only reason people support Israel is because of money. She doesn't think there could be merit. She doesn't think there could be actual legitimate values-based America defense, Western democracy reasons to support Israel. She right away goes to the oldest, worst stereotype, which is money. It's the Benjamins. That's anti-Semitism, Paul, plain and simple. That has nothing to do with Israel.
Should she have lost her position at the at the House Foreign Affairs Committee? They rebuked her publicly and in very pointed terms, but they didn't do what Republicans did with Steve King when he made racially offensive comments and remove his committee assignments. Should she have lost hers?
Well, one, I was glad to see the Democratic leadership rebuke her. It was the proper thing to do. If I'm the Democrats, I would, of course, remove her from that committee, unless you want somebody so anti-Israel to be a symbol of who the Democrats are today. So I would remove her from the committee, both for the political message it sends and the substantive issue. You don't want somebody on that committee with those views. Now, President Trump has called on her to resign, and I don't think that's appropriate. I think decisions about who serves are left up to the people. But committee assignments, that's up to the leadership.
All right. Thank you, Ari. Appreciate your being here. When we come back, as William Barr is sworn in as Attorney General, we'll look at the mess he's inheriting at the Department of Justice, including those explosive new claims by former FBI Director Andrew McCabe. And Barr, who is taking the reins of the Justice Department for the second time, is inheriting an agency in disarray, including new claims this week. The top DOJ officials discussed removing President Trump from office under the 25th Amendment. We're back with Kim Strassel, Jason Riley, and Alicia Finley. So, Kim, what do you make of the extraordinary admission by Andrew McCabe that FBI officials, DOJ officials were thinking about removing a duly elected president months after the election?
Yeah, well, it's crazy to have to go here, but I'm going to go there. I mean, essentially what they were doing is engaging or at least contemplating a coup. Because, look, this is not the FBI's job, right, Paul? The FBI's job is to investigate. It's to recommend prosecution. Or if it really believed what it believed was happening here, that somehow this president was unfit to serve in office or was colluding with the Russians, its job is to inform senior leaders of Congress who can then go down the road of impeachment, or to inform other senior members of the cabinet who could look at the 25th Amendment. The FBI has no role here, and the idea that they thought this was appropriate just says everything about Jim Comey and Andy McCabe and their sense of their own importance and no rules about what they needed to follow in order to in their jobs.
Just to follow it up, Jason, 25th Amendment was passed in order to deal with president who's physically or mentally incapacitated. Okay, it's not somebody who is. It's not to say some president we don't happen to like.
Right.
So this is. I'm not sure that this has ever happened before.
I agree. I'm as shocked as Kim is. These guys seem to have turned the FBI into an arm of the Democratic National Committee, in essence, to do what they were doing. Now, of course, Andrew McCabe is not the most reliable narrator here. He is out there trying to sell a book right now, and Rod Rosenstein has disputed this account that he was going to wear a wire, whatever, on the president. But this is shocking stuff. This is not what we expect our FBI to be up to, our Justice Department to be up to. And I know we're going to talk about Bill Barr soon, but clearly this agency, this department, is in need of some adult supervision.
Alicia, Bill Barr confirmed, but with only 54 votes. 3 Democrats, Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona, Joe Manchin, West Virginia, Doug Jones of Alabama, where he was confirmed unanimously, if I'm not mistaken, back in the George H.W. administration. What do you think Barr's main task is as justice?
Well, he's going to have to impose some discipline on the Justice Department and the FBI and kind of corral these guys who are basically becoming political agents. I also think he needs to provide more oversight. The Solicitor General, which has submitted some kind of strange amicus briefs to the Supreme Court, such as last year in the Weyerhaeuser decision, saying that critical habitat does not actually need to be habitat. And there's just such a diffuse organization that he needs to impose discipline on.
And get some kind of political order on it to actually run the department. Sessions, because he was, for a variety of reasons, just hadn't done that, I guess is what you're saying.
Right. And so some Obama-era prosecutions as well as investigations have continued, that of Quicken Loans. He should probably drop that one, among others.
Okay, Kim, what do you think? You wrote your column about Barr this week, and you said he's got a big task in front of him. How should he handle the Mueller probe?
Well, look, he has already said that he's not going to necessarily interfere in the Mueller probe, and that whatever findings Mueller gives to him, that he will send them along to Congress to the extent that the law allows him to. So he's been pretty clear on how he handles this. You know, it would be good, we may not hear about this, for him to certainly set some deadlines on when this gets finished. We've heard reports that Mueller is close to being done. Let's hope that's the case, but he could go in there and certainly impose a little bit more of a timeline. But look, more broadly, Paul, I think he's got to stand up and address the country and about this question of the credibility of the Department of Justice and FBI. When you have half of the country that no longer trusts federal law enforcement because of the actions it takes, it's debilitating. So that's his main task, is going to have to be somehow restoring some credibility, getting straight with Congress, and then reasserting some lines of authority and rules within this place.
Jason?
I agree. And he is the person for the job. And the fact that so few Democrats voted for him, someone who's had this job before, someone very well respected in legal circles, just tells you how partisan we've gotten here with their advise and consent role here. It's ridiculous that they would even argue that someone like Bill Barr is not qualified for this.
Paul Manafort was accused by a judge this week of having lied to prosecutors about some meetings he had. Is this related at all to the Russia probe? Do we learn anything more about the collusion?
Nothing more, I don't think. We know he's been involved in these sleazy dealings. He's lied before, but a direct connection, again, to the president, whether he knew anything about this or directed Manafort to, I don't see that. I think this is very low-hanging fruit for Mueller. If he's hanging everything on Manafort, I think there's nothing there.
All right, thank you. All still ahead. New York's high tax woes. Governor Andrew Cuomo lobbies President Trump to repeal a key component of his 2017 tax overhaul, and Amazon scraps plans for a New York City headquarters. The latest on both next.
People are mobile, and they will go to a better tax environment. People are making locational decisions based on finances. And from our point of view, that is highly problematic.
That was New York Governor Andrew Cuomo this week blaming a $2.3 billion budget shortfall on a key component of the Republican Party's 2017 tax overhaul, pointing to the $10,000 cap on state and local tax deductions as the reason the top earners are fleeing the Empire State. Cuomo paid a visit to the White House this week to lobby President Trump to repeal the so-called SALT deduction, just days before Amazon announced it is scrapping plans to build a second headquarters in New York City, drawing new attention to New York's unfriendly business climate. Scott Hodge is president of the Tax Foundation. So good to see you again, Scott. I want to ask you about this Amazon decision first, all right? The state and city were offering Amazon $3 billion in subsidies, and yet Amazon walked away. What do you make of that decision? Why do you think they did it?
I think there seems to be a populist objection or revolt against these sort of giveaways, especially for large firms like Amazon. And in fact, I was just up in New York and I heard a lot of sort of anti-subsidy sentiment. And I think that contributed to a lot of that. And that's not unusual. We're seeing that more and more across the country as states try to reach these kind of subsidy deals with big companies. And it creates a lot of real objection among people who are there in the state, especially businesses who are paying full freight, and then see someone with more political clout come in and get big subsidies. And it really creates a lot of hostility, and that's quite understandable.
Well, but you and I both know, we've watched this for a long time. States have been using subsidies to lure businesses from other states or lure a new plant or from overseas for decades. I guess one change is the magnitude. And $3 billion is a lot of money. Another change, I guess, is Amazon is just so wealthy and it's so it just has so much money. So is that how you explain it? Because they've been doing this for a long time.
Well, it's interesting to compare the subsidies given by Virginia, which is getting the other headquarters, with that of New York. New York's subsidies were twice as much per job created, about $40,000 per job, compared to Virginia, whose subsidies amounted to about $20,000 per job. And it really tells you, I think, about the differences between the tax climates in Virginia versus New York. And as you know, and we've reported on this for years, New York has one of the worst business climates in the United States, usually vying between New Jersey and New York for having the absolute worst business climate. The income taxes in New York, 8% for personal income, but in New York City, it's around 12%.
It's higher, my friend. It's higher. It's almost between, I think it's 12.6 or something like that.
12.6, yeah.
Believe me, I pay it every year. It's painful. So it's what, 48th, 49th, 50th in overall tax climate.
That's right.
So that makes the SALT deduction issue ever more damaging to New York State. Now, Andrew Cuomo's gone to Donald Trump and said, can you help me with this? Is that likely to happen?
No, it's not likely to happen. I get pretty good assurances from folks in the White House that they may be accommodating the governor, but I don't think they're going to give anywhere. And you're certainly not going to see any give in the Senate, which would also have to approve this. This is law now, and the great thing about the SALT cap is that it puts everyone on equal footing. No matter where you live in America, you're going to live with the same tax law. And we've essentially gotten rid of this open-ended checkbook where profligate states like New York and California could pass along their tax burden to Washington, really being subsidized by everyone else in America. And now we're all on the same footing. We all know what the rules are. And that's really forcing states like New York into tax competition, essentially.
But so we've heard Cuomo ring the alarm bell. No question about that, and very candidly so, although are we seeing states like New York change their behavior, change their policies to become more competitive in terms of the business climate? Because so far, at least, I don't see that happening here. Is it going to happen? Is it going to have to happen?
I think it will over time as states begin to realize that they can no longer shift this burden to Washington. But, you know, the governor tries to blame this on a blue state, red state issue, but it's really not. The SALT deduction or the SALT cap affects only a small number of very wealthy individuals who live in pockets or counties or communities that have very high property taxes along with their high state taxes as well. And if you look at New York, for instance, people in upstate New York, let's say St. Lawrence County, have an average itemized deduction of only about $2,000, where in Westchester County, the average itemized deduction is over $16,000. And so this is really about small pockets around New York City, while the rest of New Yorkers will be completely unaffected by the SALT cap.
Yeah, but in terms of the state revenues, I mean, I think that the 1% of income earners pay an inordinate, well above 40%, I think. I haven't checked the latest data, but it's up there, of all state tax revenues. So if they drive those people out to Florida or Texas or Tennessee, which don't have an income tax, that really hurts.
It does, and we're seeing the effects of a progressive income tax system and the attempts to try to deal with inequality through the tax code. You knock lots of people off the bottom, you put the burden on the top, and the consequence is people find friendlier tax climates. And New York is the best thing that's ever happened to Texas and Florida, and as you say, Tennessee, states that with much better tax climates.
All right, thank you, Scott Hodge. Appreciate it. Still ahead as the 2020 Democratic field continues to grow. A closer look at the latest entrance and what Amy Klobuchar brings to a race already crowded with fellow Senate Democrats.
But what I do have is this: I have grit.
That was Minnesota Democrat Amy Klobuchar last weekend announcing that she's joining the rapidly growing 2020 presidential field. The two-term senator and former prosecutor positioning herself as the pragmatic alternatives to some of the more liberal contenders, and a Midwesterner who can win back the key states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio.